Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to 20th Century Revolutions. Episode 2.1, Sick Man of Europe? Hi everyone, and welcome back. So my break was slightly longer than I had originally anticipated, but that's how it goes when you have a 4-month-old baby. But I am feeling re-energized with the podcast, and as they say, I am ready to rock. And you know, it's kind of funny. I have actually recorded most of the episodes so far with a baby strapped onto the front of me in a carrier. So if you listen back and you hear a little whimper or a coo, that's the baby. And while there's no baby strapped to me today, the combination of going back to work after taking some time off to be with the little one and then just adjusting to fatherhood, and well, it made the break just a little longer than anticipated. But if you would like to help me have slightly shorter breaks between each season, sign up for my Patreon, give a one-time donation, or write a review, because in the long term, that support can allow me to put more of my time and energy into doing this thing. It's like Professor Lupin would say as he hands you a hunk of chocolate. It helps. It really, really helps. All right, on with the show. So, you may have noticed that we are starting Season 2. Now, I hope this isn't confusing, but this second season is technically still part of the overall series on the revolutions of the Ottoman collapse, which we started in Season 1. But I decided to make a nice clean break to clearly signal that we are now on part 2 of this series. That is to say that this season, Season 2, which is going to cover the Young Turk Revolution, is coming directly out of Season 1. Both of these seasons, as well as the future Season 3, which will cover World War I and end with Ataturk's revolution, are all part of the overall series on the revolutions of the Ottoman collapse. You can think of it as a trilogy. We just finished A New Hope, now we're on Empire Strikes Back, and later we will get to Return of the Jedi, or maybe we'll call it Return of the Ghazi Warrior Pasha. So today, as we begin Book 2 of this trilogy, we're going to look back at the events of Season 1 to try and take stock of where things currently stand for the poor old Ottomans coming out of the Great Eastern Crisis of 1875 to 1878. And the idea here is that this retrospective will allow anyone who is diving straight into Season 2, and welcome aboard, by the way, you can get an idea of what's been going on in the Ottoman Empire throughout the 19th century. And if you are jumping straight in, please know that Season 1 covers all this stuff in much, much more detail. But I didn't want to simply do a recap, because that's, well, a little boring. So while we are going to be looking back at the events from Season 1, what I want to do most of all is reflect on what all of the craziness of the 19th century will ultimately mean for the Ottoman Empire in the big picture, and specifically how this 19th century craziness sets up the dramatic events of 1908 when the Young Turks storm onto the scene. So, the climax of last season was the Great Eastern Crisis, which was the true pinnacle of the revolutionary nationalism that had swept through the Ottoman Balkans throughout the 19th century, beginning with the Serbian Revolution, then moving through the Greek War of Independence, and finally ending with the liberation of the Balkan nation-states during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. And this war between the Ottomans and the Russians came about as a direct result of the nationalist uprisings in Bulgaria and Bosnia-Herzegovina, because it was these uprisings that had initially kicked off the Great Eastern Crisis in the first place. And then after many dominoes all began to fall in a very specific way, Russia would eventually use the revolutionary unrest in the Balkans as a pretext to invade the Ottoman Empire. And as a result of this Russian invasion, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro would all gain their official independence from the Ottoman Empire, and then Bulgaria would gain autonomy as a principality under what was now only nominal Ottoman suzerainty. And as a result of this struggle to liberate the Christians of the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire was very nearly toppled, as the Russian Imperial Army had just been moments away from marching on Constantinople, today's Istanbul. And if the Russians had occupied the Ottoman imperial capital, it likely would have brought the entire empire crashing down right then and there. But the other great powers of Europe would not have it, and the British sent their navy down to Constantinople to make sure that the Russians did not, in fact, take the imperial capital and attempt to dismember the Ottoman Empire. So, the Ottomans were saved from imminent demise by the intervention of the great powers. But again, this Russian invasion in 1877 was very nearly the moment when the Ottoman Empire fell. But it did not fall, and it would in fact go on to last for another 40 plus years. And as we know all too well on this podcast, Western European statesmen had been predicting the inevitable collapse of the Ottoman Empire basically ever since the Battle of Navarino in 1827, when the great powers intervened in the Greek Revolution and helped ensure that Greece would become an independent nation-state. But even as the great powers were always predicting this imminent Ottoman collapse following Greek independence, the Ottoman Empire would just continue to limp along for nearly a century. But the increasingly decrepit state of the Ottoman Empire throughout the 19th century, in which it basically faced one existential crisis after another, is what led the empire to come to be dubbed the sick man of Europe. And it should be no surprise to anyone to learn that this moniker of the sick man was originally coined by the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas I. And tellingly, Nicholas described the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe just a few months after the Russians had helped to bail the Sultan out amidst the crisis surrounding the rebellious Egyptian Pasha, Muhammad Ali, who had himself been poised to march on Constantinople a full 40 years before the Russians liberated the Balkans. So what I want to do today, while we look back at the dramatic events of the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, is to kind of ruminate on this idea of the sick man of Europe, and to just ask if this is really a fair label. And in considering this, we need to think about what it exactly means for an ancient and timeless empire like the Ottoman Empire to collapse. Because when Western Europeans looked towards the Ottomans and said, "Hey, look, it's the sick man of Europe," what they really meant was, "Hey, look, that once prosperous empire over there is collapsing. We gotta take advantage of this, man. I wonder if there's any way we can pry territory and resources out of this sick man of Europe before he actually dies." And in this way, the conception of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man itself had a pretty profound effect on the future course of the empire, because Ottoman collapse kind of became this self-fulfilling prophecy. Once the Western great powers became convinced that it was really only a matter of time until the Ottoman Empire would indeed collapse, they gradually began to just sort of team up on the Ottomans as they forced harsher and harsher terms on them. Now, this is not to say that the Ottoman Empire was not in an acute state of crisis in the 19th century. It absolutely was. But from what I can tell, a big part of this crisis came about as a direct result of the changing attitude of the European great powers towards the Ottoman Empire. Because in the imagination of the great powers, the Ottoman Empire increasingly became a site for future imperial domination, as Russia dreamed of reestablishing Eastern Orthodoxy in Constantinople, and the French dreamed of forging a North African kingdom out of Ottoman Algeria and Tunisia, and the British dreamed of adding the Arab lands of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine to their mighty global empire. And within the context of the late 19th century, which was the true heyday of European imperialism, the ancient lands of the Ottoman Empire were in many ways possibly the greatest imperial prize of all. I mean, it's the cradle of civilization, for Pete's sake. And so, increasingly, all of the great powers would indeed try to tear away their own little strip of meat from the sick man's rotting carcass. But like I said earlier, this process of Ottoman collapse will drag out for a really long time. And it is only with the benefit of hindsight that we now know the empire will indeed collapse in 1922 in the aftermath of World War I with the establishment of the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So now let's ruminate for a second on this process of Ottoman collapse, because it was and will continue to be top of mind not only for the imperialistic European great powers who hoped to take advantage of Ottoman collapse, but also for the leaders of the Ottoman Empire itself. Because, as we will see, the number one question for all Ottoman leaders leading up to and following the Young Turk Revolution will be, how do we save the empire, and what do we need to do to prevent it from collapsing? So, let's ask, why did the Ottoman Empire collapse? Well, the short answer is go listen to season 1 of this podcast, because it's basically a giant list of things that gradually led the Ottoman Empire to become ever more vulnerable. We've got the Turks seeing their first major defeat against the European powers in the Great Turkish War of 1683. Then the Russians demanding protection rights over Ottoman Christians after the Ottomans were soundly defeated by the Russians in 1774. Then the Serbian Revolution lit the first spark of nationalism amongst Ottoman Christians and began to throw flammable material all over the Balkans. Then the Greek Revolution saw the Greeks set a dangerous precedent as they gained full independence from the Ottoman Empire. Then the rise of Muhammad Ali in Egypt and the devastating war with the Egyptians, which led Muhammad Ali to nearly conquer Constantinople. Then you've got the Crimean War, which actually witnessed a rare Ottoman victory over the Russians, but which also is like the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, as it left the Ottomans so indebted to the British and the French that the Ottoman treasury would slowly come under the near complete control of foreign powers. And then finally, the Great Eastern Crisis saw the Ottomans finally declaring bankruptcy after decades of reckless spending, and this financial crisis came at the exact same time that all of that flammable and nationalist material in the Balkans was finally set ablaze. So yeah, in the end, the process of tallying up the reasons why the Ottoman Empire collapsed and then picking one thing is about as difficult a task as identifying a single coherent reason why the Roman Empire collapsed, or really any empire in history. We as students of history are naturally fascinated with collapse because it reveals the surprising fragility of political institutions. I mean, how could something that had lasted for over 600 years suddenly disappear? The United States is only just now coming up on its 250th year of existence. And even though everyone loves to speculate about the end of the U.S., when we really think about it, it seems crazy to imagine how the United States would just end. I mean, what in the world would replace it? And this is how it felt to live in the Ottoman Empire, or the Roman Empire, or any empire in the twilight of its life. The simple inertia of something as timeless as the Ottoman Empire is not a factor we should take lightly. Just like with any other stable political entity, millions of people had their fortunes and wealth and status and privileges all tied up in the Ottoman imperial system, and the collapse of that system would mean the loss of that wealth and status and privilege. And this is why you'll see certain Greeks, Bulgarians, Egyptians, Arabs, and even Armenians continuing to support the Ottoman Empire up to the bitter end. A lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds had a lot of reasons to try to keep the Ottoman system propped up. So yes, we can now look back with the benefit of hindsight and point to all of these different factors that we just talked about in part 1 of this series and say, look, this empire is a complete mess. Of course it's going to collapse. It's really only a matter of time. But for people living in the Ottoman Empire during its twilight, it did not seem inevitable. It was, in fact, the only thing they had ever known, and the only thing their parents had known, and the only thing their grandparents had known, and on into the deep and misty past. And this fact reminds us that one of the main tasks of a revolutionary movement is always to make the existing regime seem like some monstrous, unnatural entity that is completely out of touch and alien to the people governed by it. And the reason that this is such a necessary task is because, more often than not, the existing regime, the so-called ancien regime, seems like the most natural thing in the world. I mean, it's been around for hundreds of years. How could it not seem natural? Now, of course, everyone living in the Ottoman Empire during the late 19th century was quite aware that the empire had long been in an acute state of crisis. Financial ruin, losing peripheral territories to European imperialism and nationalism, multiple coups within just a few months, a devastating defeat at the hands of the Russians, increasing influence of European diplomats and financiers. Yeah, the list goes on and on. It is a complete mess. But again, the Ottomans would kind of just keep stumbling along, and following the Great Eastern Crisis, the Ottomans will maintain their wobbly march forward for another half a century. Again, inertia is a powerful thing, and ultimately it is going to take a truly catastrophic, earth-shattering event to fully topple this ancient empire. And this apocalyptic event is going to be the same apocalyptic event that will topple all the other empires of continental Europe. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire. And that apocalyptic event is called World War I. And for all the talk throughout Europe during the 19th century of the so-called sick man of Europe, in which Austria, Germany, and especially Russia all viewed Ottoman collapse as perpetually just around the corner, the Ottoman Empire would actually go on to last several years longer than these other three empires. The Russian Empire fell to the Bolsheviks in 1917, and then the German and Austro-Hungarian empires fell a year later in 1918. The Ottomans would end up holding out for another 4 years, and it wouldn't be until 1922 that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would abolish the Sultanate and the Caliphate and thereafter establish the Turkish Republic. So, when considering the final years of an empire, we usually ask, why did the empire fall? But in following Edward Gibbon's famous formulation on the fall of the Roman Empire, and in following historian Sean McKeegan's application of this formula to the Ottoman Empire, asking why an empire fell is in a lot of ways the wrong question to ask. And we should instead be asking, why and how did the empire last for so long? So now that we have considered why the empire fell, let's now ask, how did the Ottoman Empire manage to stick around for such a long time? Especially seeing as all of the great powers were constantly predicting their imminent demise for about 100 years. And I think the best way to consider this question is to look back at the events of part 1 of this series from a slightly different perspective, and to take stock of the many, many times that it appeared as if the Ottoman Empire was about to collapse, and when it, in fact, never did fully collapse. Because, how many times did I end an episode in part 1 saying something like, and bring the empire to its knees? And having been brought to its knees, the Ottoman Empire always just got back up and continued to chug along. So let's start with the Serbian Revolution, which really set the tone of the 19th century in the Ottoman Balkans. If you remember, the Serbs actually ironically rose up in defense of sultanic rule in Serbia as the Serbian rebels initially sought to drive the tyrannical Janissaries out of power. But what had begun as essentially a peasant uprising to overthrow local despots would evolve to become a nationalistic struggle for Serbian independence. And a big part of this turn towards proto-Serbian nationalism came about as a result of Russian intervention into the conflict. Because remember, the events of the Serbian Revolution had been interrupted by the outbreak of hostilities between the Ottomans and the Russians in 1806, as the two empires fought a conflict that was wrapped up in the broader Napoleonic Wars then engulfing Europe. And during this Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 1812, the Russians began to implement a strategy of intentionally stoking revolutionary nationalism amongst the Serbs, because Serbian nationalism was inherently wrapped up in ideas of Slavic brotherhood and Orthodox solidarity. So even in the Serbian Revolution, way back in the opening decades of the 1800s, the seeds were already being planted, which would go on to forever entangle the vines of Balkan nationalism with Russian Pan-Slavism and Russian Christian Orthodoxy. This entanglement would, of course, come to a dramatic head amidst the Great Eastern Crisis, when the Russians invaded Ottoman Bulgaria in 1877, specifically in order to liberate the Bulgarians and the Serbs, their fellow Orthodox Slavs, who still toiled under Ottoman tyranny. But just 10 years after the Napoleonic Russo-Turkish War amidst the Serbian Revolution, the Greeks would then launch their own nationalist revolution to break away from the Ottomans. And while we know all too well that it would take forever for the Russians to finally intervene on behalf of the Greeks, the Russians would eventually intervene, and this intervention would lead to the outbreak of yet another Russo-Turkish War in 1828. But even though the Greek Revolution followed a similar track to the Serbian Revolution in terms of how they both became intertwined in huge empire-wide conflicts between the Russians and the Ottomans, the Greek War of Independence was a real turning point in Ottoman history. Because at the Battle of Navarino, which honestly took us like 3 or 4 episodes to really fully work through the long-term consequences of, this battle saw the intervention of not only the Russians, but the British and the French as well. And this British and French intervention is why we can mark the Greek Revolution as a turning point. Because from this point on, the 19th century imperialist projects of the British and the French empires will become ever more intertwined with the Ottoman Empire, as France would use its expedition into the Greek peninsula of the Peloponnese as sort of a training ground for their much more significant expedition into Ottoman Algeria that would eventually see France controlling most of North Africa. And this territory had for centuries been the dominion of the Ottoman Empire. And then the British, for their part, would actually emerge as the nominal allies of the Ottoman Empire, as they used the policy of maintaining the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire, basically as a way in which to halt Russian expansion southwards towards British India. But even as the British claimed to be the allies of the Ottomans, they still gradually came to dominate the Ottomans, mainly through financial leveraging, which would eventually see the Ottomans become hopelessly indebted to the British and the French. And then, as we'll see in our next couple of episodes, the British will also begin to extend their own imperialist tentacles into Ottoman domains as they take control of Cyprus and Egypt. So, the Greek Revolution led to yet another defeat for the Ottomans at the hands of the Russians. But possibly even more importantly, it set a dangerous precedent as the British and the French increasingly began to meddle in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire. Now, over the next 50 or so odd years following Greek independence in 1829, the Ottomans would actually begin to strengthen their position diplomatically on the world stage. And in a weird way, this improved international status indirectly came about as a result of Muhammad Ali's rise in Egypt. And seeing as we dedicated 2 entire episodes to Muhammad Ali, it is safe to say that the great Egyptian Pasha was quite important. But Muhammad Ali's impact did not only stem from the fact that he created a de facto independent dynasty down in Ottoman Egypt, but also from the fact that he nearly toppled the empire. Because for all the talk of a Russian invasion bringing down the Ottomans, no single event brought the empire closer to collapse than Muhammad Ali's invasion of Syria and Anatolia. As we know, Muhammad Ali's son, the ruthless general Ibrahim, had been poised to march on Constantinople in 1832. But then the Sultan was bailed out, somewhat incredibly, by the Russians themselves. Then, when Muhammad Ali re-emerged just a few years later and Ibrahim was once again threatening the capital in 1839, the Sultan was once again forced to turn to the great powers for aid as the British, French, and Russians came to the rescue of the Ottoman Sultan. So yes, Muhammad Ali had been poised to take the Ottoman capital on 2 different occasions, but the great powers had come to the aid of the Sultan and helped him send Muhammad Ali back to Egypt. Now, it is very easy to view this great power bailout as kind of a weak sauce move on the part of the Ottomans. I mean, they had been forced to turn to their arch nemesis Russia to help them in fighting off of one of their own rebellious governors. And in this way, it was kind of a weak sauce move. But in another sense, this courting of Russia, and later Great Britain and France, to help fight off Muhammad Ali reveals an emergent strategy of Ottoman statesmen at the Sublime Porte, in which the Ottomans would turn towards diplomacy as the primary way in which to ensure the empire's survival. Because as the Ottomans began to fall behind militarily, Ottoman diplomats would begin to put a lot of effort towards courting the different great powers and even at times playing the powers off of one another. And this diplomatic gamesmanship would continue to be one of the primary foreign policy strategies for the Ottomans in the years following Muhammad Ali's defeat. Because directly in the wake of the final defeat of Muhammad Ali, the Tanzimat era of reform would begin in the Ottoman Empire. And these liberal, European-influenced reforms initiated during the Tanzimat were in many ways specifically calculated to satisfy the demands of the great powers. Or in other words, with the onset of the Tanzimat era, the Ottomans were basically deciding to relent to great power demands for internal reform, specifically in an effort to build a powerful alliance bloc to ensure their protection against their enemies, both foreign and domestic. And in this context, we can better understand how the Ottomans went from being completely diplomatically isolated during the wars of the Greek Revolution in the 1820s to having some very powerful allies by the 1850s as France, Great Britain, and the Italian kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia all sided with the Ottomans in the Crimean War. And with the help of these powerful allies, the Ottomans were able to successfully fight off the Russian invasion into Ottoman territory that started this war. And the Ottomans would even gain back a bit of territory previously lost to the Russians. Now, the most common explanation of this anti-Russian alliance bloc is that Great Britain decided to defend the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War simply in order to halt the southern advance of their Russian imperial rival. And this is a pretty accurate interpretation, and in fact, it is the interpretation I offered in my own accounting of these events in episode 1.11, The Eastern Question. But alliances are two-way streets, and we can just as easily credit the Ottoman victory in the Crimean War to years of pretty masterful diplomacy on the part of the Ottomans. In the decade between the defeat of Muhammad Ali in 1840 and the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853, Tanzimat leaders in the Ottoman Empire had been tirelessly courting the British and the French in order to build an alliance in opposition to the Russians, who were always hungrily eyeing the Balkans. And it is no coincidence that the primary architect of the Tanzimat program, a man named Mustafa Rashid, who honestly probably got short shrift in part one, got his start in politics as an ambassador to Paris and later to London. So in the years leading up to the declaration of the Tanzimat Reform Program in 1839, Mustafa Rashid had already been developing close ties with British and French diplomats. And when Mustafa Rashid and his comrades pushed through the Tanzimat reforms, they were very aware of British and French desires for the Ottomans to reform the internal functioning of their empire. And this absolutely colored the liberal nature of these Tanzimat reforms, especially when it came to the Tanzimat's promises of ensuring the rights of Ottoman Christian populations. So, we can chalk up masterful diplomacy on the part of Tanzimat leaders like Mustafa Rashid as one big reason why the Ottoman Empire did not fall in the period leading up to and following the Crimean War. Because when the Ottomans defeated the Russians in the Crimean War alongside their British and French allies, the victory was not only a very helpful boost for the Ottomans internationally, but perhaps even more importantly, it was a catastrophic defeat for the Russians. Because the Crimean War had revealed the Russian Empire to be much weaker than anyone expected. And when compared to the newly modernized British and French militaries, the Russian Imperial Army proved itself to be way behind the times. Now, the Ottomans in the Crimean War also proved themselves to be in a similarly backwards position. But they had at least somewhat began to modernize, first under Sultan Mahmud in the 1820s, and then later during the years of the Tanzimat in the 1840s. The Russians, on the other hand, had not begun this process of modernizing their military really at all. And critically, following the disasters of the Crimean War, the Russians would begin a long process of reform. And this reform would extend beyond the military, as Russian leaders sought to bring all of Russian society out of the dark medieval past, with the most dramatic example of this era of reform coming when Tsar Alexander emancipated the serfs in 1861. So, in an interesting way, these two rival empires, the Ottomans and the Russians, both embarked on some pretty audacious and transformative empire-wide reform projects in the middle to late 19th century. And these parallel projects of great reform in the Russian and Ottoman empires were initiated specifically in an effort to gain the upper hand on each other, because both the Russians and the Ottomans knew that it would only be a matter of time until another Russian-Ottoman war broke out. But in the years following the Crimean War, the Ottoman leaders of the Tanzimat would begin to make some missteps, and these missteps mainly centered around the empire's finances. Because, as we have noted many times, in order to fund their sweeping reform projects, Tanzimat leaders had taken out massive loans from British and French financiers. And the increasing indebtedness of the Ottomans to British and French bankers made the partnership between the Ottomans and their Western allies increasingly unequal. And this process of increasing financial dependence would culminate when the Ottomans defaulted on their public debt in October of 1875. And this declaration of bankruptcy by the Ottomans would put them in an unimaginably weak position once the Great Eastern Crisis really began to take hold in 1876. Because as uprisings began to break out amongst the revolutionary nationalists in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Bulgaria, this ruinous financial state meant that Ottoman leaders would have to rely on irregular soldiers to put down the rebellions in the Balkans. And this decision to rely on irregular forces would lead to the massacring of tens of thousands of Bulgarian civilians at the hands of the infamous Bashi Bazuk in the wake of the April Uprising. And as Western Europe began to hear about the so-called Bulgarian horrors, the Ottomans found themselves once again diplomatically isolated, as decades of carefully cultivated goodwill with the great powers during the Tanzimat went out the window basically overnight. And then, when the great powers decided to hold a conference in Constantinople to discuss the ongoing crisis in the Ottoman Balkans, the Ottomans were in such a weak negotiating position due to their recent bankruptcy that the great powers were essentially able just to dictate terms to the Ottomans during this Constantinople conference in the winter of 1876 to 1877. So, going into the year 1877, the Ottomans found themselves back in a very similar position to where they had been 50 years earlier during the Greek Revolution, when anti-Christian atrocities perpetrated by the Ottomans in reaction to revolutionary nationalist movements in the Balkans had led to their complete diplomatic isolation on the world stage. And just as had happened in the wake of the Greek Revolution, this isolation led to another devastating defeat at the hands of the Russians. But this time, the Russian Imperial Army would in fact make it all the way to the gates of Constantinople. But as we know, the great powers would, as usual, dictate the course of events in the Balkans. And specifically, the British would not allow the Russians to take Constantinople, as they sent a naval fleet down to the Ottoman imperial capital to ensure that the Russians would behave. Now, the initial Treaty of San Stefano and the later revised Treaty of Berlin were both, on the surface, extremely humiliating settlements for the Ottomans, as they were essentially forced to give up nearly all of their territory in Europe. But during the negotiations surrounding the later Congress of Berlin, Ottoman diplomats would return to their tried-and-true strategy of playing one great power off of another, as the Ottomans were able to strike a deal with the British in which they offered the British control over the island of Cyprus in exchange for British support at the Congress of Berlin. And with this British support, the Ottomans were able to come out of the Congress of Berlin somewhat decently. I mean, yes, they had to give up a ton of territory, but they maintained control of a good chunk of the southern Balkans, retaining the strategic regions of Macedonia and Thrace. And from a prestige standpoint, and at this time prestige is a bigger deal than you might think, This meant that the Ottomans had not been driven out of Europe, which had been the primary goal of the Russians during their invasion. And then the independence of the Balkan nation states of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro, and the new autonomy of Bulgaria would actually end up being a blessing in disguise for Ottoman finances. Because during the Congress of Berlin, the great powers would split up the Ottoman public debt amongst these new nations. And while this was pretty terrible for Serbia, Romania, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, for the Ottomans, this made their public debt actually somewhat manageable. So, once again, careful diplomacy on the part of Ottoman statesmen had allowed the empire to continue to limp along, even after the Russian imperial army had literally been a step away from taking Constantinople. And with that, we are now caught back up with events. The Ottomans just faced a near fatal blow during the Great Eastern Crisis, and they lost a huge amount of their territory in the Balkans as a result of this defeat at the hands of the Russians. But as they had done over the past 50 years, the Ottomans would continue just to stumble forward. And in terms of great power maneuvering, the Ottomans would not face another war with their Russian imperial rival until the Great War. And in terms of the Ottoman-Russian rivalry, the War of 1914 will be the final act in this ancient conflict, as World War I will see both empires fall off the face of the earth. So, moving into the final decades of the 19th century, the Ottomans would continue their tried-and-true strategy of using careful diplomacy to ensure the empire's survival. But as we'll see, the Ottomans would begin to turn away from their old alliances with the British and the French, and instead turn towards Germany. And this budding relationship with the Germans will come to define Ottoman foreign policy in the years leading up to World War I. But along with remaking the Ottoman Empire geographically and shifting Ottoman alliances, the Great Eastern Crisis and the war with Russia also brought a new sultan to power. And for Ottoman domestic affairs, the ascension of Sultan Abdul Hamid was honestly probably the most important development, especially within the everyday lives of Ottoman subjects. Because the reign of Abdul Hamid will increasingly come to be defined by widespread paranoia, as the Sultan's chronic fear of assassination and of being overthrown will lead Abdul Hamid to grow a giant secret police that will become ever more involved in the lives of Ottomans of all stripes. And it would become a common saying in Ottoman lands that at least one person from every family was in fact an undercover agent from the Sultan's secret police. And ultimately, it will be Abdul Hamid's repressive and at times murderous paranoia that will forge the coalition of revolutionaries who will eventually overthrow him. So, join me next week as we introduce possibly the most controversial sultan in the history of the empire, Abdul Hamid, the Red Sultan.